Hi, my name is Meg Lowry. I'm a physiotherapist in Brisbane, Australia, and I really appreciate your interest in these projects that I have been working on for the last few years. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the development of engaging exercise tools for prehabilitation and rehabilitation, namely the Clock Yourself app and a couple of other projects I'm working on, the Balance Yourself book and the Sit Stand Think app. So I live in a subtropical climate in Brisbane. You're welcome to come and visit anytime. It's a wonderful place to live and work. It gets a little bit hot, but it's nice to be, I'm mostly on the road throughout the day in my air-conditioned car or in my clients' homes. We have a river, and we also have, that is not the river, we have right next to that is a river, and that there is a artificial beach, because we're too lazy to drive 1 hour to the Gold Coast or 1 hour to the Sunshine Coast, so we have our own little beach in the middle of the city. This is another river that has played on my mind for quite some time since I started studying public health. My master's degree was in health services management, looking at a lot of public health problems, and I realised that in the physiotherapy world, particularly with older adults, we are really working downstream. We wait until people have had a period of functional and physiological decline that has led them to deteriorate to a point where they've reached a threshold where they're falling and fracturing, and then once they've had a fall that was injurious, they end up being referred on to a fall prevention program. So I don't think we're really practicing fall prevention, we're really practicing fall reaction. And I think that in order to do true prevention, we need to go right upstream, and I mean baby boomers even. So I'm trying to look at how I can better engage the baby boomer population in exercise to help to mitigate a physical and functional decline. And in a population like that, where people are still working, where they are, there's this aging happening in the background, but it's certainly not in the foreground. The wheels haven't fallen off the cart yet. There is no sense of urgency to engage with a physiotherapist around exercise for better balance or agility or strength. So I think we need to actually appeal to them in a different way, make our programs a bit more fun, and look at what motivates them. And what I've found motivates them is brain health more than physical health. And so I think we can kill two birds with one stone by helping to optimize brain health as well as physical health with some of the dual tasking work that we have done typically as physiotherapists in the rehab population. It actually applies quite well to the prehab population. So I'm going to show you some of the things that I've been playing around with now. So the one that you are probably most familiar with is the Clock Yourself app, which started off with me just putting a metronome in one ear and then recording my voice on an iPhone, so that I had some prompts that had changeable speed, that I could give somebody and set somebody up with a Bluetooth headset at a station in the room, and they could listen to the prompts and react by stepping to the numbers on an imaginary clock face on the floor. I also had a folder of exercises that I just made like a fairly reasonable progressible sequence of balance exercises, starting from feet apart, eyes open, to more difficult things like standing on your tippy toes and standing on one foot, turning your head, eyes closed, etc. And the idea was that my clients could have an assessment where I would say where they start, and I had numbered, they were all numbered, and so I'd say this is where you start, you're going to start on number 14 or whatever, and you can practice this exercise when you get to this station, and when you manage to do it for 30 seconds without having to touch the table, then you can change to the next station, and the next page in the folder, so the more challenging exercise. And then I want you to mark down your name against it so we know which one you're up to for next week. And as it turned out that I would give them like one page from the book and say, this is your exercise to master at home this week. Now, if you're on silver level 5, I want you to master silver level 5 at home, and hopefully next week you'll manage silver level 6. But what actually happened was people would say, can I have the whole folder? Because what if I master silver level 5 by Wednesday? and I want to keep progressing. And I want to get my husband doing it too, because he really should be doing this, but he won't come to classes, or he's got something else on. And I've also got a neighbour who I think would really like it, and she'd asked for a copy of it herself. And so it then meant that I needed a lot of education in the book as well before I would give it out to anybody else. And it basically developed into a tool that a lot of people were requesting and circulating around their retirement villages. And so became the Balance Yourself book. I'm not sure if I'll have time to talk about that much today, so if it interests you, you can go to www.balanceyourself.physio and you can preview the education component and some samples of the exercises. Sit Stand Think is my baby at the moment. It involves it's another exergame like Clock Yourself, so an exercise-based video game, but it's in app form, and it involves standing up and sitting down repeatedly and aiming for a high velocity sit to stand, because we know that high velocity reps of sit to stand are associated with better cognition and reduced hospital risk, etc. Okay, I want to acknowledge that I did not invent clock face stepping exercises. You've probably done them too. It's a pretty common bread and butter exercise. We work on this for weight shift. Most people do it sequentially though, like 12, 1, 2. I randomized it and then put it in an app where I could basically have a pace that was set, so I'd be able to document if their pace improved, and then I made it fun. And this is what the home screen looks like. Well, it's not the home screen, but the first game screen looks like at the bronze level of Clock Yourself. You could change the speed there. You'd be able to set the duration there. In the options menu, you can set a full clock face or a half clock face. So if you want the person to be able to stand and hold the bench while they're doing the exercise, or at least have their hands floating above the bench as a little bit of extra standby protection, you could do that. Or you can come up with your own games that maybe only need to have 6 numbers in them rather than 12. There's a little instructions video in it as well. So because the audio is going through here at the moment, you won't be able to hear it, but I'll just show you basically what it would do. As a number comes up on the screen, they have to step 1 foot to that number and return their foot to the center, ready for the next one. That's quite fast at 50 steps per minute, but obviously you can change it to any speed. You can go down to like 5 steps per minute. So it's suitable for people with Parkinson's, I think. Okay. What I am sort of more proud of, because like I said, I didn't invent clock face stepping exercises, but I believe that Xbox Connect and Wii Fit was just sitting in the too hard basket for a long time, despite there being pretty good evidence in favour of exergaming for both cognition and falls in multiple populations. I, as a clinician, had access to them in my outpatient rehab clinic and never used them. And it was just because it takes too much time to set up and calibrate with one person, to teach a person an interface that is not particularly user-friendly for people who are not tech-savvy, and some of the older adults that I worked with are not tech-savvy. So I think the other reason was that it wasn't going to translate into a home exercise program for them, because I might only have them in my inpatient rehab unit for a couple of weeks, or outpatient clinic for a little while, but I can't really get them to do this exercise in their own homes, to go to Kmart, spend $350, carry the box home, and then try to set it up on their television, because I know that I really almost always need help setting up something like that on my television. So there was a lot of reasons why I don't think they're practical, but when actually set up in a clinical trial, they work really well. So this was an alternative solution to make it more, basically more affordable and accessible to us, to recommend to our clients, and can put on their iPads and run with it, basically. This is the trial that inspired Clock Yourself. It was a randomized controlled pilot study of home-based step training in older people using Dance Dance Revolution. So these were 37 people living in a retirement village in Sydney. There was a control group from there, so half of them in the intervention group were set up with this system of a mat on the floor with arrows on it, and it connected to television, and the television would say step up or left or right, and they had slowed down the typical Dance Dance Revolution from the arcade game, and also overlapped, instead of the techno music, they overlapped like Elvis Presley or Johnny Cash. And what they found was that they improved postural sway, they improved choice step reaction time, and they improved dual tasking on the dual task tug verbal fluency test. So I wanted that in my practice and in my community exercise classes, and I wouldn't have been able to set it up anyway, really, but I was just trying to find an alternative, and it didn't exist. So that's why Clock Yourself was first developed on my own phone as an app without anything visual at all. So I just want to make sure that we check our understanding of the stepping strategy, because I think that the education that I received at university is inaccurate, or at least outdated now. I was sort of taught that the ankle strategy is the first strategy that would be used if somebody's balance is displaced, and then the hip strategy, and then the stepping strategy is a last resort. And so if you think of them in that order of priority, you might not get around to training the stepping strategy with your patients. We'll do sideways steps and backward steps and maybe crossover steps, but we don't do fast steps in all directions, sometimes because we're worried about safety, and sometimes because, I think we just see it as the last resort one that we don't always get to before they're discharged. But it is not a strategy of last resort. It's often initiated well before the body approaches the limits of stability, and this is especially true for older people. Older adults are more likely to use a step to recover their balance, they're more likely to also step at lower perturbation magnitudes than younger adults. We know that the stepping strategy is slower in the response, the lift-off, and the landing times as you get older. But we also know that this is particularly pronounced, this difference, this slowness is particularly noticeable in choice reaction time conditions where the person has to make a decision before they step. And a normal stepping reaction is not a reflex, it is a choice reaction, because actually what the brain is doing is saying, the last time my center of mass was displaced in this direction, I executed this motor response and caught myself. I'm going to execute the same motor response again. If my center of mass is going in another direction, they're going to execute a different motor response. So they're actually making a choice. And choice reactions begin slowing in our late 20s. So simple reactions, reaction time begins slowing in our 50s, but choice reactions begin slowing in our late 20s. So when we think about trying to optimize somebody's course of aging, we shouldn't be thinking only about older adults. We should be thinking about all of us across the lifespan. What is pre-wired in terms of this decline, and what is reversible or what can be mitigated with structured intervention? And early intervention, I stress, I believe is more desirable than late stage intervention. Just a side note about stroke, because I do a lot of work with stroke, 71% of stroke patients in this inpatient rehab facility, I think it was in Canada, had impaired stepping reactions at discharge. And we know that 73% of patients who have survived a stroke fall within the first 3 months after discharge from rehab. So I think that we probably could be doing more here, and I know that one of those authors there, Avril Mansfield, has been working on it tirelessly, trying to improve how we work on stepping reactions in stroke, and she's just done a study in perturbation training in a harness in stroke survivors, and it was unfortunately not effective. So you can train stepping strategies in two ways, with perturbation training or with volitional step training. And I'll go on and show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But first, a little brain break, and we'll get you moving, because we should be reducing our sitting time. So I would like you to prepare to stand up and sit down a few times now. This here is the color green. When you see the color green again, stand up and sit down straight away, ready for the next color. You'll see it a few times, so you'll have to stand up a few times. Ready. Okay, hopefully you're refreshed and ready to switch back on again. So, like I said, the stepping strategy is an impractical strategy to train as well. So I think we deprioritize it partly because we think it's a last resort thing to work on and we have other greater priorities, but also because it's just, how do you teach people to take fast steps without pushing them over? And there's a risk involved in doing that. We know that we shouldn't be getting people to do, especially unsupervised, fast walking exercises. So fast anything with somebody with poor balance is a little bit more sketchy to practice in real life. I just wanted to point out that I think it's still worth exploring because balance training is achieving, or balance intensive exercise interventions are achieving somewhere between a 21% and 39% reduction in falls. This is according to the Sherrington meta-analysis. And that's probably where Otago sits, at the higher end of that. And I put it to you that Otago is very much a downstream intervention, and I think it's a wonderful intervention. It's a gold standard, and I teach it and I use it where the resources are available. But it's not upstream, and I think we need something different upstream, and I'm proposing that some of these tools might be more effective upstream. Okay. We can achieve a 50% reduction in falls with the stepping strategy training using volitional, so fast steps, or reactive steps, so perturbation training. This systematic review and meta-analysis was published the same time as Kathy Sherrington's one, actually, to be honest. They were working on it separately, although one of the authors is on both, Stephen Lord, and he's the most published researcher for falls in the world, hands down. So it's certainly not something to ignore. It was a well-designed systematic review, although the sample sizes were smaller, but there were fewer articles of high quality to select for inclusion in this systematic review compared to a normal exercise intervention for falls prevention type of systematic review that Kathy carries out. What they basically did was they combined together the stepping strategy training interventions, so both fast steps in unanticipated direction where you're not pushing someone over or tripping them up, and then the ones where they're in a harness and you are pushing them over or tripping them up. What they found was that it can prevent falls by approximately 50% in older adults in community and institutional settings, and that this 50% reduction in falls is can be attributed to improvements in reaction time, gait, balance and balance recovery, but not in strength. So I think we should look at that a little bit differently. Strength training is super important for mitigation of frailty and sarcopenia and all the rest, and strength training is probably quite important in fall prevention, as a fall prevention intervention for a deconditioned population who have got a very slow 5-time sit-to-stand time or something like that. But I think these studies, particularly with exergames and harnesses, you are recruiting generally a slightly more robust population to your studies like that. And so they are less likely to have significant strength deficits in the legs anyway. So if someone's able to stand up and sit down quickly from a chair several times, training their strength more in their legs probably wouldn't have necessarily as much of a substantial improvement or at least be the best choice for that purpose. I think that we can do more by training the brain to think faster and react faster. Okay, so pretty strong words from Stephen Lord here and Yoshi Okubo. Step training should be a major component of exercise fall prevention interventions. It should be either volitional or reactive. They did separate the two, perturbation training and volitional step training, for subgroup analyses. And again, that makes the sample size smaller, so I encourage you to read it and scrutinize it yourself, but I think it holds up pretty well. And what they found was that the volitional step training was, I think, about 57% reduction in falls, and the reactive step training, the perturbation one, was 49% reduction in falls. When they averaged them out, it ended up being around 50% for the two of them together. So the goal for me was just to build this low-tech, exergame. I wasn't trying to be high-tech and fancy. I wanted it to be low-tech and easy enough for people to use who might not have grown up with technology their whole lives, with adjustable stepping speed. And the idea was that I might not need to use mats or wires or sensors if I was cluey about it. So all I wanted to do was to take the elements of Wii Fit or Dance Dance Revolution that I think were actually bringing about the positive outcomes in the studies, and they were basically training steps that are large, fast, and in unanticipated but appropriate directions. And I also noted that there is some cognitive, attention tasks going on as well here, and that there was a higher cognitive load doing these Wii Fit kind of exercises. So I think that's important because we know that choice reaction is under cognitive control. So as you increase the cognitive load, you will slow down the psychomotor speed usually. And so I wanted to make sure that I had some way of increasing the cognitive load of the clock yourself exercises. I used a clock face because I know that I used this screening tool so often when I was working in an aged care assessment team in the community. We know that the clock drawing test is not really sensitive enough to pick up subtle cognitive impairment or mild cognitive impairment because it's such a familiar mental model that even people with mild cognitive impairment can reliably draw a clock face. They might struggle with setting the time to 10 minutes past 11, where the 2 is symbolic of 10 minutes and rather than 2 minutes. And that sort of represents maybe an impairment in that higher executive functioning. So what I recommend doing is to actually screen your patients with a clock drawing test before you start clock yourself. If they can draw a clock face reasonably, just draw 2 feet in the middle of it and just get them to sort of understand what that's about before you even show them a digital screen. Maybe start the exercise with your own verbal prompts before you show them a digital screen. And if they like it, then introduce the app. If they aren't able to set the 10 minutes on that clock, if they don't have that symbolism, then don't progress to the higher levels of the app and just stick on bronze. That would be my recommendation, because the other levels have abstract reasoning and symbolism and things like that in them. So basically, if we add 12 coordinates around the feet that are familiar, that the person can visualize, then we don't need the mats and the sensors. We would put down those coordinates on the floor, actually put the numbers on the floor. If somebody needs visual cues, such as those with Parkinson's, they'll take a larger step with a visual cue. Ataxia, peripheral neuropathy, things like that, there might be a reason to help sort of calibrate that lower limb motor control, but otherwise I tend not to bother with putting numbers on the floor. And I think that if the person doesn't have to do that at home, they're more likely to do the exercise. It removes a barrier. They really like to work on the brain. The brain motivates people so much. So this is one example of an early abstract reasoning clock face in the gold level, which you'll find in the options button. You'll step to 25. If it says 25, you would step to number 5. If it said 55, you would step to number 11. So it's not learning, not memorizing anything new. It's already here, but retrieving it quickly is more difficult. This one involves learning something new. These are just examples of some of the clock faces. You would have to actually embed new memories here. Pieces at the top of the world. Heart, there's one heart in my chest. 2 starry eyes. 3, a triangle has 3 sides. They come up with their own way of memorizing it themselves. And when you let them do that and take the time to do that, maybe set it as an exercise program for the week. So I might introduce this at the end of a balance class and say, next week we're going to use this clock face. See if you can memorize the 12 symbols on the clock. And you can also introduce something like that as a half clock face first, just so they only have to memorize half of them at a time. So I wanted, as I saw that my clients were really enjoying these activities and they kept adding more and more requests, and I realized that I couldn't keep this on my phone any longer, I asked a friend to make an app for me. And I knew that if this was motivating people to exercise and they were coming back saying, it's too slow, can you give me a faster version on my phone and a faster version again? And I was Bluetoothing these things across. Look, I just thought, wow, they're sharing it with their families. They want a faster version for their grandchild. If I found a physical activity that motivates some people to do more physical exercise, I shouldn't be keeping it to myself. And if I want to show the world how well it works, people won't believe me. just saying that it works in my practice. I want to make sure that we can do research on it. So I'm not a researcher, I never will be a researcher, but I wanted to make sure that I got it to the research community as early as possible, and that I could try to create some parameters that would make it a bit easier for them to research it, to make the stepping speed measurable particularly. So the process was a good friend Dave, who I stretched the friendship with a little bit by adding more and more and more features, because I set up some focus groups of clients, which I thought would be a good idea to help to sort of test its acceptability and usability. And so I made sure that it was a diverse group of clients, people with neurological conditions, people without, baby boomers, people who were, 103, and I would say at the end of your balance class, or at the end of our next one-on-one session, do you mind if we stay back for half an hour and you help me improve this so that it works better for someone like you? And I would get such great ideas from them, and so many of those clock faces are actually contributed by my patients, not by me. And so I'd go back to Dave and say, oh, there's one more thing I need you to do. I just want you to put it in 6 other languages as well, because they like to learn the numbers 1 to 12 in other languages. And, in the end, I had to pay him more than we had initially planned, and I also gave him 30% of the stake in this app, which is one of the reasons why it is important that at some point it actually pays for itself and can start bringing in a profit for poor Dave as well, because he worked on it for, about a year solid. I'd say he didn't get a lot of other work done that year. It takes a really long time to code these kind of things. So some key things that they said that I think is worth noting from the focus groups. They want as many buttons as necessary, but as few as possible. They were happy to add extra features that interested them, that gave them more variety in the exercise, like all the other clock faces, but they didn't want to have to calibrate anything. So they didn't want a sensor on each foot, which they would calibrate with the device to give them feedback about their accuracy. They said, if you need it, absolutely need it, well, we would do it, but it would slow us down, and so I probably won't do it as often. And it would be a real pain in the classes to take it off one person's shoe and put it on another person's shoe. And I decided that I didn't think we did need it, as long as they were stepping in the direction that they intended to step. Whether they were right or wrong was sort of not really as important, as long as their brain was busy. And you find that people tend to recognize when they're wrong and self-correct. Once you start playing with it, you'll realize that people don't make a lot of errors without sort of self-correcting anyway. They didn't like things that make them feel old, so they didn't want an older person demonstrating the exercise in the app. So we ended up going with an animated character, because I wasn't comfortable putting a younger person demonstrating the exercises, largely because I actually was worried about the physio community telling me that it was inappropriate to have a younger person demonstrate the exercises, because I was quite confident with a fairly broad focus group, a couple of broad focus groups, that it wasn't going to offend the older adult population much, but or at least the majority of them that were sort of represented there. But I thought that it would not be so well received by those of us who think we know what older people want. Another thing was that they were past caring about their body. They're motivated by the brain. That was a real factor for them. And they wanted me to respect their time, so that I didn't sort of set it up that they had to do certain number of hours on it a week. They wanted to be able to fit it in when they wanted to do it. And I thought that this might be okay in a more upstream population where they haven't really been falling necessarily, like the healthy aging classes, because Kathy Sherrington's work suggests now that you need 3 hours a week for a cumulative total of 50 hours in order of intensive exercise interventions with a balance focus in order to change somebody's falls risk significantly. That's a very onerous amount of exercise, and if the evidence says it's what people should do, it's what they should do. But we have to take into account two things. One, that was the recommended dose performed, recommended dose, not the dose performed, because those studies didn't report dose performed. And two, this is a downstream population of fallers, generally, that are recruited to these kind of studies. So I think we're working with it. I actually designed Clock Yourself to be useful for rehab and versatile enough to be useful for, people who are stepping very slowly, etc. But I actually my goal is to make it suitable and engaging for prehab, and I don't think we have those same kind of dose parameters nutted out yet of what is enough to maintain and improve choice step reaction time in particular in a more higher functioning population, rather than to rehabilitate those who have fallen and hurt themselves and all the rest. So I won't go there just for time's sake. This is basically what the screen looks like when they first open it up. There are some safety instructions that I encourage you to read to your patients and make sure that they understand them. That bronze level is that basic screen that I showed you before. The silver level involves motor dual tasking. That can be quite hard for some people. I'm not sure that I put it in the right spot. Maybe it should actually be gold. Conceptually it makes sense to be there, but you might find that some people actually find this harder than some of the earlier gold level exercises anyway. So punching 1, 2, and having to not time it, but follow a pattern of left punch, right punch, left punch, right punch, when the lower half of the body is not following a pattern. That's pretty damn hard. You can, though, go into the options and deselect punches. You can just have a bilateral bicep curl with every step, for example, or a bilateral chest press with every step to get that motor dual tasking. So you can deselect things that aren't appropriate for you or your patient. There is, so this is a gold level. This is the early abstract reasoning. If it says November, you would step to 11. April, you would step to 4. Those are the minutes that I showed you before. This one is you have to divide by 2 before you step. So a bit of mathematics. I like it because I think it works on inhibitory control. So we know that that's a higher executive function, and I'll explain to you my rationale here. If a person is used to stepping forwards for number 12, and then it says on this clock face 12, they have to divide by 2 and actually step backwards to where number 6 is. And so they have to not step where they're used to stepping and override that. This is where you start to use memory. So one of my patients is a Chinese man with a brain injury, and he suggested we use the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac to remember. So we have 6 slithering snakes, and people remember it their own way. A dozen rashers of bacon for number 12, for example. One of my clients really likes Taurus, Sagittarius, etc. I really don't like this clock face, but that's why you do focus groups. And if you set up focus groups, it's important to actually validate them and let them be heard and explore some of their ideas as well, whether you think it's going to be popular or not. You could probably take them out later on if it doesn't test well with a bigger group, but I think it's important to make sure your focus group actually feels heard. And so Solomon was a retired chemical engineer, and he really wanted the elements of the periodic table, hydrogen, helium, etc. This is probably the one I'd recommend if you want to do memory work, though, because it's easier visually to see. At the platinum level, you can mix and scramble clock faces, so you can go into the options, and in here you'll find you can select your clock face, multiple clock faces. So you might say, I want to do the symbols, the animals, and the months of the year, and the numbers, but I want to do the numbers in English and French. So it's like speaking 5 languages at once. You don't know which prompt you're going to get next. You just have to remember what clock face they're all from. It's actually not so hard as long as you slow down the speed. So when you increase cognitive load, you must slow down the speed initially for the person to, because their psychomotor speed will be reduced initially. So then you'll actually be able to see that improvement. They'll see it. It'll be measurable when they feel that they can increase the speed. And that sort of immediate achievement, I think, helps to motivate people. Sorry, what's next? There we go. I'd like to change this one. I don't want to call it cardio anymore. I think I should call it agility, because you can certainly get cardio, and I know that it's used in cardiac rehab, outpatient rooms and outpatient classes. You can get cardio at bronze level if you've got the stepping speed up fast enough. But this is really about higher level agility, maybe for your concussed athlete or anyone who was previously like a master's athlete. You can get them to touch the numbers on the floor and jump to numbers at this level. there's a picture of our animated fellow that in his metrosexual pants with his Akubra hat that my clients approved of. He had to be changed a few times as well. So here we are at a point where we've got about 5,000 downloads in over 20 countries. We get requests for new languages. I did actually give in and allowed some Dutch people to record their own prompts for Dutch and send it to me, and then we uploaded it into the app. But I won't do that again because you'll actually hear that the Dutch language quality is very different to the rest of it. So we're going to have to work on another way of language translation in the future. There are a few university research projects using Clock Yourself, a small feasibility trial in Canada that I think is complete. So I think that Laura Giangorio is probably now applying for funds for a bigger project, which is pretty cool. In Australia, where I live, we don't call it Australia here, it's called Australia, mate. So in Australia, there has been one trial that's just been completed. It was just a small university project with a sample size of, I think, 25. And they were actually looking at using Clock Yourself to detect concussion in athletes, younger athletes. And I can't tell you the results of that trial other than to say that it's quite promising to pick up the subtle be that at the moment the gold standard tests are probably missing. So that will probably go on to be published, and then there'll be a larger study come from that soon, so it's pretty cool. And then in the USA, there is a study being done at the University of the Pacific. They've got it through ethics, which takes a long time, but they've got it through ethics, and they're looking at recruiting in total 120. They're starting with 40 to see how they go, and they're going to be using Clock Yourself and Balance Yourself, which I don't think we have a lot of time to talk about the Balance Yourself project today. So yeah, that'll be in community dwelling older adults. We had 2 mega trials here in Australia that I had sort of invested my efforts into getting Clock Yourself included in, and I talked to the professors, and they were so excited about it, and they included it in the application. The application took 11 months. It got approved, which is like one of those kind of the highest level grants that you can get. They were including it with another intervention. One was a dementia prevention trial and one was a fall prevention trial, and so it was actually approved and everything, and then we started planning the research design and planning the research collaboration agreements, and in the end it got too hard at their end with the powers that be above them to include something in their study that they didn't own the intellectual property for, because it was such a large study with so much, it was a multi-million-dollar study that was going to take 4 years of a university associate professor's time. There was a risk analysis involved, and there's certainly a risk in if I was to be unreliable, like I could sell this to Lumosity tomorrow or something, and then their trial would be compromised. And so in the end, it was unfortunately dropped from the trial, and I was pretty gutted about that. But I got some advice from those researchers, and it was that this is very much evidence-based already. As long as you can show where the evidence comes from, then make it available. Don't wait for the research to come out. It'll take 4, 8, 12 years before you get good sample size kind of research that people can hang their hats on anyway, that's replicated and really robust. And by that time, the thing's going to be archived. And the technology might be outdated. There might be something better available, and you should just make this one available to the community now and let the researchers continue to develop their things within the academic framework that they are doing, but just it takes so much time. So I was a bit disappointed about that. That's not how I envisaged it to be. So I am probably next year going to start marketing Clock Yourself and Sit, Stand, Think Together as brain games that move you, rather than anything to do with falls, because I just don't want to make those kind of claims when we don't have the evidence to back it up yet, even though I can show the evidence that suggests that this volitional step training is important and that it works. The NHS just recently endorsed it with, if you're not familiar with mytherapy.co.uk, have a look there. They recently endorsed Clock Yourself, which is wonderful. I'll show you a quick picture of a lady using it for prehab. and a gentleman using it for rehab. A half clock face, the bottom half is selected. And this is just to get you to think outside the clock. Oh, I just realised you can't hear. I don't know what we're going to do about that. I can hear the prompts. The prompts are basically numbers and months. And so if they say November, he has to walk forward to number 11. And then it'll say, you know, May, and he has to walk backwards to number 5. So we don't have to always do it on a round clock face because the audio is suitable for people. There were some people in my focus groups who loved the app, use it in the class, owned an iPad and still wouldn't put it on their iPad. They had issues of like security. They were worried about downloading things, downloading a virus, all that sort of stuff. I think there's going to be that resistance in a population that's sort of half tech savvy and half not. So they requested Clock Yourself on a CD, and I didn't think it was possible, but the more we nutted it out together, we realised it actually is possible. So I drafted a book with the different clock faces and an explanation of the clock faces and what to do with them, and then how to use a CD, put the CD in the CD player and press play and change the tracks. And when they change the tracks, so when they skip to the next track, it'll go to a faster track. So you can start off at like 10 steps per minute and go up to 120 steps per minute by just changing the track. So I'd love to make that available for everybody, but like the CDs are printed. I've got 5,000 CDs printed in storage in my office, which is a pain, but I then realised I couldn't afford to print the books. They cost so much to print, and you have to print really in bulk to be able to print them. And I just couldn't afford it. Until Clock Yourself pays for itself, this probably won't happen unless the right grant shows up that I can apply for, which is a bit unfortunate. But if anyone wants to do research with this, get in touch with me and I'll get you a copy. That's an example of the CD. This is an example of a man in a harness doing the exercise in Las Vegas in a balance center. That's what I thought I would see on social media when people picked up on it. I did not expect to see this kind of thing. This is an athlete with no cognitive impairment, no falls, well, no great falls risk, but he has obviously broken his ACL because they put my logo up here saying that it's ACL rehab tool. The guy actually got in touch with me, the physio in Alabama, and sort of said afterwards, is this okay? I was like, sure, it's okay. It's not what it was meant to be used for, but you go for it. That's a wonderful application of the app. And it shows that it is an intergenerational tool, so it's not exclusively for older adults, and I object to making anything exclusively for older adults because I don't know when that age ticks over that now you're an old person and you can only do old person exercises. So the evidence here, I have to head off in a second. The evidence here for you to explore, cognitive processing speed and choice step reaction time are the strongest predictors of fall risk. Cognitive processing speed and choice step reaction time can be improved with exergaming interventions. We know that systematic review said that step training can prevent falls by approximately 50%, and that it should be a major component of exercise fall prevention interventions. And in reality, fast steps in unanticipated directions are not being used much, but check this one out. Exergaming improves cognition in clinical and non-clinical populations. This was a systematic review that came out last year after I'd already produced Clock Yourself, so it was the icing on the cake. I'm not going to go through the balance training stuff because we've talked about it already in a previous slide, and I will suggest that you have a look at the correlation between higher velocity sit-to-stand capability and cognition and hospitalisation. So a quick snapshot of Balance Yourself. There's the website there that you can have a look at the bottom. It goes through the positioning of your hands and the importance of having your hands floating above a solid surface. It's one exercise per page. The static standing balance exercises will have a white background. They basically say what to do with your feet and what to do with your head. And this is just another example, Silver Level 3. So the ones that are a bit harder to write up for a home program, scribbling out on the spot. Silver Level 8 is another example. This is Leo doing silver level 8 exercise at the bench. And this is an example of the cognitive dual task suggestions that you've got as well within the app. So people like tongue twisters, and my clients suggested the tongue twisters that would be used. This is an example of the dynamic balance exercises, the highest level dynamic balance exercise in the app, and that all the dynamic exercises are on a different type of page that you have to turn them around. They're on a floorboard so that you can actually sort of show the difference and say, I don't want you to do the ones on the floorboards unless I'm here, for example, if you're using it with a patient. This is basically just to show you where I'm at the moment. So I've produced this and it's available. It's $3 Australian, so maybe $2 US. I'm not sure what that means in pounds in the app stores, and there's no ads in it, which was important to my focus groups. This one here is I've made it, but I can't afford to commercialize it. This one here is available for sale, and mostly physios buy it, but every now and then someone else comes across it. I don't promote that book yet, but I want to maybe change it before I do. It's pretty good, but it's still not where I want it to be. I will produce a Balance Yourself app at some point, but maybe late next year. Sit, Stand, Think is in the beta testing mode at the moment, internal beta testing, but we want external beta testers maybe around January. So if you're interested in beta testing Sit, Stand, Think, please get in touch. I will produce some flashcards as a no-tech version as well for those who don't like to use smartphone devices or iPads. So, everything that you want done well won't be done quickly unless you've got a huge amount of money to pay a big team to do it. So I have to remind myself of this all the time because I get a bit fed up with how long it takes to get things done. I'd just like to show you Sit, Stand, Think just briefly. Basically, here what you need to do is you'd start out with a deck of cards that maybe look a bit more like the solitaire deck, so you might have some self-efficacy around using a game with cards like this, and the person would have various challenges, easy or hard, depending on the level that they choose. It might say stand up when you see an odd number, or stand up when you see an even number that is a spade or a diamond. Then we added decks of cards that were more interesting, like animals, but the interesting thing was that they didn't like animals like that. They wanted animals looking right at them. So no to this duck, yes to this duck. Didn't have to see the whole duck, just his eyes. That was important. And they'd marvel at how did they get the duck to look right at them? Isn't that amazing? So they were really impressed with things like Zoom and less impressed with things like Bluetooth. Like a zoom on a camera was extraordinary. Also didn't really like to see pictures of older people too much. Again, and this is a different group that I used as my focus group. Don't like the older people, like looking at younger people, which doesn't sit so well with me. Love babies and baby animals, so I had to put fewer older people, although I made sure they were still represented, and more babies and baby animals. They didn't like it if I was to say to memorize where people are from. So in the faces deck, you have to memorize where people are from. They didn't like it if I had to memorize that she was from England. They were like, just make her from Bangladesh. It's too hard. Which didn't, again, sit well with me because I didn't want racial profiling. But in the end, I gave up and I realized that there was a lot of discontent with that notion when I would have a little Chinese boy and say that he's from Canada. That really bothered them. And they weren't necessarily being racist. They were really trying to simplify the task for themselves, I think. So here is a preview of Sit, Stand, Think. So if you would like to do a little brain break, if you have time for it, then this will go for about just a bit under a minute, I think. When you see a city in the southern hemisphere, stand up and sit back down again, ready for the next picture. When you see a country in the northern hemisphere, stand up and sit back down again, ready for the next picture. Denmark, Honolulu, Cairo, Rio de Janeiro, Ireland, Italy, Kathmandu, Japan, Bulgaria, Melbourne, Armenia, Cambodia, Berlin, Canada, New York, Cape Town, Moscow, New Zealand. Well, I couldn't make New Zealand look too appealing or else people wouldn't want to visit Australia. So if there are any Kiwis in the audience, sorry, not sorry. If you'd like to get in touch with me and follow my journey or support me in some other way, contribute to the app, for example, by all means get in touch. I'd say I'm more responsive on LinkedIn and Twitter messages than I am with email these days, admittedly. But you can try that too. And you can also reach out to me in the Senior Rehab Project Facebook group where I hang out quite a bit. I'm one of the hosts now of the Senior Rehab Project series. I do the Down Under series. So we have a fabulous podcast that is free to download, and it's on Spotify as well, and it basically is for any rehab clinician who wants to better serve older adults. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.